porcelain shattered against the Italian marble floor, the sharp crack echoing through the cavernous foyer. Another nanny dashed toward the front door, weeping hysterically and clutching a bruised cheek. Aloysius dragged a hand down his face. He controlled the city's underworld, but couldn't control a toddler. Bleach fumes burned the back of Nia's throat, sharp and chemical, lingering in her nasal passages. She dug the stiff bristle brush into the grout, her knees throbbing against the cold, unforgiving stone floor. $7 an hour. That was the math looping relentlessly in her head, drowning out the chaos erupting 2 floors above her. $7 an hour meant she could afford the electricity bill this month, assuming she didn't eat lunch for the next 2 weeks. Her knuckles were ashy and cracked from harsh detergents. The dark skin pulled tight over her bones, protesting with every scrub. Footsteps thundered down the grand staircase, heavy, expensive leather slapping against marble. Aloysius Choi descended like a storm cloud wrapped in charcoal wool. He smelled of stale tobacco, rain, and cedarwood cologne. A sharp, heavy scent that cut aggressively right through Nia's cheap lemon floor cleaner. His tie was loosened, his dark hair falling into eyes that held the deadened, hollow look of a man who had been awake for 3 days straight. Right behind him, a woman in a crisp, overly starched uniform practically tumbled down the carpeted steps. She was sobbing loudly, cradling her wrist against her chest. "I can't, Mr. Choi. I just can't. He's a monster. He bit me." Aloysius didn't even look back at her. He pulled a thick clip of cash from his inside suit pocket, the crisp paper rustling, and tossed it onto a velvet-upholstered bench without breaking his stride. "Take it and go." The woman snatched the money, her sobs hitching, and bolted. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in its wake, punctuated only by the heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Well, almost silence. A high-pitched, furious screech shattered the quiet. Oliver, 2 years old, sole heir to a criminal syndicate that strangled the city's ports, and currently throwing a wooden toy block with the aggressive accuracy of a major league pitcher. The block bounced hard off the mahogany banister and skidded across the freshly polished floor, stopping inches from Nia's yellow plastic bucket. Nia sat back on her heels. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her forearm, leaving a streak of gray dust across her dark skin. She was bone-tired. The transit bus ride from the south side had taken an hour and a half. The heater was broken, and her joints still held the damp chill of the morning commute. She simply didn't have the energy for rich people nonsense. Aloysius stood at the bottom of the stairs, running a heavy hand over his jaw. He looked completely emptied out. A ruthless mob boss who commanded absolute terror with a single glance in a boardroom, currently defeated by 30 pounds of rage in a designer onesie. Oliver stood at the top of the landing, face flushed violently red, chest heaving, preparing to launch a heavy stuffed bear. Nia watched from the periphery, keeping her head low. She wasn't supposed to be seen. The temp agency had been explicitly clear. "You are the deep, clean crew. You do not speak to the family. You are a ghost." Oliver shrieked again. His little fist clenched tightly at his sides and began stomping down the stairs. He was a terror. Over the past 3 days she had been scrubbing these baseboards. Nia had seen 4 nannies quit. Oliver kicked, he scratched, he threw hot oatmeal, he bit until he drew skin. He was a feral, grieving animal trapped in a gilded, silent cage. Aloysius took a step forward, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the large room. "Oliver, stop!" The toddler ignored him entirely. He reached the bottom of the stairs, locked furious brown eyes with Aloysius, and deliberately kicked a decorative brass urn sitting on a pedestal. It toppled over with a deafening clatter, spilling dry potting soil across the pristine floor Nia had just swept. Nia's jaw tightened. She gripped the handle of her brush until her knuckles ached. $7 an hour. Aloysius sighed, a ragged sound that caught painfully in his throat. He reached out to pick up his son. "Come here." Oliver twisted violently, thrashing his small arms, his closed fist catching Aloysius squarely in the jaw. It wasn't a soft hit. Aloysius' head snapped back slightly. A flicker of something dark, dangerous, and deeply ingrained passed over his aristocratic features before he forcefully wrestled it down, swallowed by sheer exhaustion. He set the boy back down onto the floor, rubbing his jaw with a heavy sigh. Freed from his father's grip, Oliver turned his destructive gaze toward the only other person in the room. He spotted the bright yellow bucket of soapy water. A chaotic, triumphant gleam appeared in his tear-filled eyes. He charged. "Oliver, no," Aloysius barked, stepping forward, his expensive shoes sliding slightly on the dust. But the kid was fast. He barreled toward Nia, aiming a swift, angry kick right at the side of her plastic bucket. Water sloshed violently, spilling over the plastic rim and soaking instantly into the knees of Nia's faded denim jeans. The freezing, dirty water seeped through the thin fabric, biting into her skin and sending a shock of cold up her thighs. Nia froze. She looked down at the puddle spreading rapidly across the marble she had spent 20 minutes scrubbing. She looked at the soaked fabric clinging heavily to her legs. Then, she slowly raised her eyes to the toddler standing triumphantly in front of her. Oliver planted his small hands on his hips, breathing hard, waiting for the inevitable. He waited for her to yell. He waited for her to cry and run away like the woman in the crisp uniform. He waited for the fear. Aloysius stepped forward quickly, reaching into his pocket again. "I apologize. I'll have the agency send—" "Hold on," Nia said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It cut through the thick tension in the room, like a razor blade. Aloysius stopped abruptly. He blinked, genuinely taken aback. No one interrupted him. Not his captains, not his rivals. Certainly not a maid kneeling in a puddle of dirty floor wax. Nia didn't look at Aloysius. She kept her dark eyes locked firmly on Oliver. The toddler stared back, his bottom lip trembling slightly, uncertainty creeping into his previously rigid posture. She didn't smile. She didn't soften her features or slip into a high-pitched baby voice. She just stared at him with the tired, unimpressed gaze of a woman who had raised 3 younger siblings in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment while her mother worked back-to-back double shifts. "You think you're tough?" Nia asked, her voice flat, devoid of any coddling. "Kicking a bucket of water. Real brave." Oliver blinked. He took a tiny, hesitant step back. Nia reached into the bucket, the cold water stinging her cracked skin, and pulled out a large, heavy industrial rag. She wrung it out with deliberate, forceful twists, the dirty water splashing loudly back into the plastic tub. She tossed the damp rag onto the floor, right at Oliver's designer sneakers. "Wipe it up," she demanded. Silence descended on the foyer. It was a thick, heavy silence. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking the seconds. Aloysius stared at her, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. His hand rested instinctively on the pocket of his trousers, where Nia knew he kept a weapon. "What did you say to him?" Nia finally looked up at the mafia boss. Up close, the contradictions in his face were stark. He had sharp cheekbones and an immaculate jawline, but a small, jagged white scar cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes were cold and calculating, yet rimmed with the deep purple bruises of chronic insomnia and stress. "I said he needs to wipe it up," Nia replied, her tone matching his in its absolute lack of intimidation. She was too exhausted to be scared. Fear was a luxury for people who had something to lose. She was already late on rent. A bullet might actually be a vacation. He made the mess. He cleans it. Aloysius opened his mouth to speak, a commanding, brutal rebuke forming on his tongue. But a sound stopped him cold. A small grunt. Both adults looked down. Oliver had dropped to his knees. His tiny hands gripped the oversized, damp rag. With clumsy, sweeping motions, he began pushing it across the wet marble, smearing the soapy water around rather than absorbing it. He wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He was intensely focused on the task, his little brow furrowed in concentration. Nia watched him for a moment. Her shoulders, previously tense and hitched up to her ears, dropped a fraction. She reached out, her rough, callous fingers gently adjusting his clumsy grip on the rag. "Not like that. Use your weight. Push." Oliver looked up at her, his big brown eyes studying her face intently. He smelled like baby powder and sour milk, a stark contrast to the harsh chemicals burning her nose. He shifted his weight, imitating her movement, and managed to actually soak up a small puddle. "Better," Nia muttered. She pulled another rag from her apron pocket and started wiping the floor beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "Though your technique is garbage." Oliver paused. He dropped the rag. He looked at Nia's face, at the deep exhaustion etched into the skin around her eyes, the stern set of her mouth, the utter lack of pity or fear that usually surrounded him. Then, without any warning, the toddler lunged forward. Nia flinched instinctively, raising a rough hand to block what she assumed would be a slap or a vicious bite. Instead, Oliver threw his small arms around her neck. He buried his face in her collarbone, inhaling the scent of her cheap laundry detergent and the sharp tang of bleach. Then, he pulled back slightly, grabbed her cheeks with his wet, sticky hands, and planted a loud, sloppy kiss right on her nose. Nia froze, her eyes wide, her hands hovering awkwardly in the air. The toddler giggled, a bright, chiming sound that seemed to shatter the oppressive, heavy gloom of the mansion. Above them, Aloysius let out a long, ragged exhale. The air in the room shifted, the heavy threat dissipating into something else entirely. Curiosity, desperation. Aloysius studied the black woman kneeling on his floor. She wasn't beautiful in the polished, manicured way of the women in his circle. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy knot, escaping in tight coils around her face. Her uniform was cheap and ill-fitting, but his son, the boy who had put a seasoned child care professional in the hospital with a scratched cornea 2 days ago, was currently leaning against her side, babbling softly and playing with the metal zipper on her apron. "What is your name?" Aloysius asked. His voice was no longer a bark. It was quiet, measuring, steady. Nia wiped her nose with the back of her wrist, glaring down at the toddler who was now trying to eat the zipper pull. Nia Lawson. Nia Lawson, Aloysius tasted the syllables, his accent barely there but present in the clipped consonants. "You work for the cleaning service." "Until you fire me for making your kid do manual labor, yeah," she replied dryly, gently but firmly pushing Oliver's hand away from her mouth. "Don't put that in your mouth, kid. It's got floor juice on it." Aloysius pulled a sleek black cell phone from his pocket. He tapped a single button and held it to his ear. "Cancel the contract with the Nanny agency. Tell them to go to hell." He paused, his dark eyes never leaving Nia's face. "And get the head of the cleaning service on the line. I'm buying out a contract." Nia stood up quickly, wincing as her stiff knees popped loudly in the quiet room. She grabbed the handle of her bucket. "Whoa, wait. What do you mean buying out a contract?" "I clean floors, Mr. Choi. I don't do kids." "You do now," Aloysius said. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The bone-deep exhaustion was still there, but a fierce, immovable resolve had settled over his features. "I will triple whatever they are paying you. Full health insurance. A private driver to bring you here and take you home." Nia scoffed, a bitter, cynical sound escaping her throat. "You can't just buy people." "I buy people every day, Miss Lawson," Aloysius said, the ugly truth slipping out with chilling, matter-of-fact ease. "But I am not buying you. I am hiring you. My son responds to you. I need someone who won't run away crying when he throws a tantrum." Nia looked down. Oliver had wrapped his arms tightly around her leg, resting his chin on her damp jeans, looking up at her with big, expectant eyes. She thought about the final red-stamped notice from the electric company sitting on her cramped kitchen counter. She thought about the empty cupboards and the rattling radiator. She looked back at Aloysius. He wasn't pleading, but there was a visible crack in his armor, a silent begging in the tightness of his jaw. He was a dangerous man, a violent man whose world was stained with things she didn't want to know about. But right now, he was just a father drowning in deep water, offering her a raft. Nia sighed, a long, heavy exhale that felt like it emptied her lungs completely. "Quadruple my salary, and I want Thursdays off." Aloysius Choi stared at her for a long moment, the ghost of a smirk finally breaking through the cold, deadened mask of his face. Done. 3 weeks into the job, Nia stopped noticing the sheer, suffocating scale of the Choi estate and started noticing the quiet. It was a heavy, expensive quiet. The kind of silence that cost millions of dollars to maintain, built on soundproofed walls, reinforced steel doors, and a staff trained to walk like ghosts over the imported Persian rugs. Nia refused to walk like a ghost. Her rubber-soled sneakers squeaked aggressively against the polished hardwood floors. She hummed off-key R&B tunes while loading the industrial dishwasher. When Oliver threw a tantrum, she didn't shush him in frantic whispers. She let him scream until his lungs tired out, sitting calmly on the sofa, filing her nails with a cheap emery board until he eventually crawled into her lap, exhausted and hiccuping. The kid was still a menace, but he was a predictable menace. He liked his toast cut into exact triangles, he hated the texture of velvet, and he only went to sleep if Nia sat in the rocking chair and rhythmically tapped her foot against the floorboards. A steady, thumping heartbeat in a house that otherwise felt dead. Aloysius Choi remained a phantom. Nia saw the aftermath of his existence more than the man himself. A heavy crystal tumbler left on the mahogany study desk, smelling sharply of aged scotch and cigar smoke. An impeccably tailored charcoal suit jacket draped carelessly over a velvet chair. The lingering scent of cold rain and expensive cedar wood in the private elevator. When their paths did cross, it was usually in the dead of night. It was a Tuesday, just past 2 a.m. Nia had fallen asleep in the nursery chair, her neck protesting with a dull, throbbing ache as she jolted awake. She pulled a thin fleece blanket over Oliver's sleeping form and slipped out into the dimly lit hallway, desperate for a glass of tap water before calling her driver. She padded down the grand staircase, her socks slipping slightly on the marble. As she reached the ground floor, a sliver of warm yellow light spilled from the cracked door of Aloysius's private study. Nia hesitated. Her contract said childcare. It didn't say anything about checking in on syndicate bosses. But the silence in the house felt different tonight. Tighter. Strained. She pushed the heavy oak door open with a soft creak. Aloysius was sitting behind his massive desk. He didn't look like the untouchable phantom of the underworld. He looked like a man slowly drowning. His tie was entirely gone, the top 3 buttons of his crisp white shirt undone. He was staring blindly at a stack of manila folders, a half-empty glass of amber liquid sweating onto a leather coaster. "You're paying me too much to sleep in the chair, Mr. Choi," Nia said, her voice cutting through the thick, heavy air. Aloysius's head snapped up. His eyes were red-rimmed, the dark circles underneath them looking like bruises in the dim lamplight. His right hand instinctively twitched toward the open drawer of his desk before he registered her face. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples with his knuckles. "Miss Lawson." His voice was raw, like he had spent the last 5 hours shouting. "I thought you went home." Kid had a nightmare. Woke up kicking. Figured I'd stay until he went under deep. Nia walked further into the room, stopping at the edge of the desk. She didn't shrink under his heavy gaze. She just looked at him. "You look like you got run over by a freight train." A hollow, humorless chuckle escaped Aloysius's throat. He picked up his glass, the ice clinking sharply against the crystal. "A freight train would be a merciful alternative to my current logistics problem at the docks." "I don't need to know about your business," Nia interrupted flatly. She crossed her arms over her chest. The cheap cotton of her oversized sweater felt glaringly out of place among the antique globes and leather-bound books. "Plausible deniability. I just keep your kid from biting the chef. That's the deal." Aloysius took a slow sip of his drink, his dark eyes studying her over the rim of the glass. The stark contrast in her fascinated him. She was brutally practical, entirely unsentimental. Yet he had watched on the security cameras as she spent 45 minutes carefully gluing a broken wooden train back together just so Oliver wouldn't cry when he woke up. "You are not afraid of me," Aloysius stated. It wasn't a question. "I've got a landlord who threatens to break my kneecaps if I'm 2 days late on rent, and my little brother thinks it's a good idea to hang around the corner boys on 63rd Street, Nia replied, her tone dripping with exhaustion. She leaned against a tall bookshelf. "You sit in a nice warm room and drink $80 liquor. You don't scare me, Mr. Choi. You just look tired." Aloysius's jaw tightened. The jagged white scar through his eyebrow pulled taut. People feared him. People revered him. People tried to kill him. No one ever looked at him with the sheer, unfiltered annoyance of a woman who just wanted to go to bed. "Aloysius," he said quietly. Nia raised an eyebrow. "If we are going to co-parent a feral toddler in the middle of the night, you can drop the formalities," he said, pouring another splash of liquor into his glass. "Call me Aloysius." Nia snorted, pushing herself off the bookshelf. "Whatever you say, boss. Drink some water. You look like a corpse." She turned and walked out, leaving Aloysius sitting in the dim light. He watched the empty doorway for a long time, the sharp burn of the alcohol fading into a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. The illusion of safety shattered exactly 2 weeks later. Nia was in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing dried oatmeal off a plastic dinosaur plate when the house fundamentally changed. A loud, mechanical grinding noise echoed through the walls, followed by the heavy metallic thud of steel security shutters slamming down over the floor-to-ceiling windows. The ambient soft lighting snapped off, instantly replaced by harsh pulsing yellow emergency bulbs. The quiet was dead. Heavy boots pounded across the marble foyer. Shouts in rapid, sharp Korean echoed down the corridors. Nia froze, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She didn't scream. Her survival instinct, honed on rough city streets, immediately took over. She dried her hands on her jeans, grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove, and moved silently toward the service hallway. Oliver was at a private playgroup with a security detail. He was safe. A heavy body slammed against the swinging kitchen doors. Nia tightened her grip on the skillet, raising it to shoulder height. The door pushed open, and Aloysius stumbled into the kitchen. He was a wreck. His bespoke suit jacket was gone, his white shirt torn open at the collar. A dark, wet stain was rapidly spreading across the left shoulder of his shirt, the fabric sticking grossly to his skin. He smelled violently of sulfur, burnt ozone, and the sharp metallic copper tang of an open wound. He leaned heavily against the marble island, his chest heaving, his face drained of all color. "Put the pan down, Nia," he grunted, his voice tight with pain. Nia slowly lowered the iron skillet. Her eyes locked onto the dark crimson stain spreading across his shoulder. Panic flared briefly in her chest, hot and bright, but she brutally stamped it down. This was the reality of the 7-figure salary. This was the dirt beneath the marble. "You need a hospital," she said, her voice admirably steady despite the slight tremor in her fingers. "No hospitals," Aloysius rasped, sliding down slightly against the counter. He clamped his right hand over his left shoulder, his knuckles white. "My private medic is 20 minutes out. Traffic on the bridge." "You're leaking all over the imported tile," Nia muttered, stepping forward. She didn't wait for permission. She grabbed his right arm, her rough hand surprisingly strong as she hauled him upright. "Come on, up. Let's get you to the sink." Aloysius hissed in pain, his large frame leaning heavily against her much smaller one. He was burning up, a hot, clammy sweat clinging to his forehead. They hobbled awkwardly to the massive stainless steel farmhouse sink. "Sit," she ordered, pushing him down onto a heavy wooden bar stool. Nia tore open the massive industrial first aid kit mounted on the pantry wall. She didn't know trauma medicine, but she knew how to clean a mess. She pulled out heavy gauze, a bottle of harsh chemical antiseptic, and medical shears. She stood between his parted knees to reach his shoulder, their proximity sudden and jarring. Aloysius let his head fall back, his breathing ragged. He watched her through half-closed eyes. The pulsing yellow emergency lights cast deep shadows across her face, highlighting the tense set of her jaw and the fierce concentration in her dark eyes. "This is going to sting like a bitch," Nia warned, gripping the neck of his ruined shirt. Without waiting for a response, she pulled the fabric apart, popping the expensive buttons. The wound was ugly. A jagged graze across the meat of his shoulder. It wasn't deep enough to hit the artery, but it was messy. Nia unsealed the antiseptic bottle. The harsh chemical smell completely overpowered the scent of his cologne. She poured it directly over a thick wad of gauze and pressed it hard into his shoulder. Aloysius let out a guttural, choked snarl. His body jerked violently, his hand shooting out and gripping Nia's hip with bruising force to anchor himself against the blinding pain. "Hold still," she snapped, though her own breath hitched at the tight, desperate grip of his fingers digging through her jeans. For a long moment, the only sounds in the kitchen were the mechanical hum of the lockdown system and their overlapping, ragged breathing. Nia kept the pressure on the wound, her knuckles turning white. Aloysius's head dropped forward, his forehead coming to rest heavily against her collarbone. He was trembling. The untouchable mafia boss, the phantom of the city, was shaking like a leaf against her cheap cotton sweater. "It's over," he murmured into her neck, his voice a low, gravelly vibration against her skin. "The threat is neutralized." "I told you, I don't care about your business," Nia whispered back, though her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. Her free hand, almost against her own will, came up to rest on the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his damp, dark hair. Aloysius tilted his head up. They were inches apart. He could see the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes, the faint smear of flour on her cheek. She wasn't beautiful in a delicate way. She was real. She was entirely, solidly real in a world made of lies and violence. The adrenaline was a live wire between them, sparking with heat and the primitive, desperate relief of survival. Aloysius moved first. He didn't ask. He simply closed the distance, his mouth crashing into hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was rough, jarring, a collision of teeth and split lips. He tasted like copper, stale espresso, and raw desperation. Nia gasped, a sharp intake of air, her hands freezing on his shoulder. Her brain screamed at her to push him away, to preserve the boundaries that kept her safe. Instead, her fingers tightened in his hair. She kissed him back. It was an ugly, desperate kiss, born out of stress and the harsh fluorescent shadows of a locked-down kitchen. He pulled her closer, his uninjured arm wrapping tightly around her waist, dragging her flush against his chest. Nia's heart thundered against her ribs, completely drowning out the mechanical hum of the security shutters. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. The heavy silence rushed back in to fill the space between them. Nia took a slow step back, her hands dropping to her sides. She wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, her eyes locked on his. Aloysius watched her, his chest heaving, the cold, calculating mob boss entirely stripped away. He looked vulnerable, exposed. "The medic is going to be here in 10 minutes, Nia said, her voice rough, stripped of its usual armor. She turned around, gripping the edge of the cold stainless steel counter to stop her hands from shaking. "I'll go unlock the service entrance." She didn't look back as she walked out of the kitchen. She couldn't afford to. The marble floors felt colder than ever beneath her feet. And as the yellow emergency lights pulsed overhead, Nia realized the terrifying truth. She was no longer just a ghost scrubbing floors. She was in the dark with him. Did Nia's fearless attitude and Aloysius's dark, dangerous world keep you completely hooked? When two exhausted survivors collide, the heat is absolutely undeniable. If you love this intense, grounded mafia romance and want to see more stories that ditch the cliches for raw, real emotion, hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves a tough-as-nails heroine, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping romance stories every single week.